Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing the album Spartacus by the band Triumvirat.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
But before I do any of that, let me just remind us all, let's reminisce on the past. When I started this series off, this is how I used to record my videos. On my phone's camera, I would sit with this very unflattering downwards angle and I would record these videos, and honestly, this feels so long ago by now. And today we're at episode 364. Tomorrow is the finale, so you should definitely go ahead and check it out because it's gonna be an amazing video. And yeah, I'm just really excited for it, and I'm just really excited to think about the past and think about the future and think about now and see how far I've come. But anyways, here are some of my favorite bits from this album.
Spartacus stands, sword in his hands, drawing a bloody line all around.
So in yesterday's video we've taken a look at the band Can, which happened to be a band from Germany hailing from the city of Cologne, much like today's band that we're talking about being Triumvirat. Now, despite these two bands actually forming around the same time and coming from the same place, their sounds and styles could not have been more different. Now, Triumvirat in today's episode actually breaks a new record on the series, a record which this album is going to hold, and that is the furthest distance between two albums of an individual band to be found on the list. Yes, we've had a lot of bands which had big hiatuses between me checking their one album out and then checking another one, but this band, I've checked out Triumvirat in episode 10 of the series, and since then it has been a long 354 days since I got to hear of them again. And looking back on episode 10 and episode 10 Naomi that didn't know how to do anything back then, I was still really discovering what I was doing on this series. I was trying new things and I was failing in many of them, and honestly it's quite cringeworthy to watch these videos, but I sometimes do that. And well, if there's one thing that I didn't do back then was to really give a proper backstory and overview of the bands that I was reviewing. And of course with a band like Triumvirat, which I've fallen in love with their sophomore album since then, I do feel like it is only appropriate for me to actually tell you a bit about how these ones came to be. So the band Triumvirat formed back in 1969 in Cologne, Germany by Jürgen Fritz on the keyboards, and joined him there was also Werner Fragenberg, which played the bass and did the vocals, and to the two there was also Hans Buttheld on the drums and percussions. And now their chosen name was actually quite foretelling of their capabilities. You see, the name Triumvirat of course comes from a play of words on the word triumvirate, which basically means a group of three very powerful individuals, which is definitely what this band was. Now, in the few first years of their career, this group actually played around nightclubs and they played the most popular charting hits at the time, as well as incorporating some different sort of songs from bands like The Nice and ELP. But by the year of 1972, this band has completely abandoned doing cover songs and instead opted to perform their own original materials, mainly inspired, as I said, by Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Now, when it comes down to it, I know that the biggest criticism against Triumvirat Triumvirat is them being basically a copy band of ELP, but I do think that the reason why these guys actually worked out and a lot of other bands failed where they stood is because most bands just couldn't really match to the hype and the amazement that ELP were, but led by Jürgen Fritz, Triumvirat definitely was able to do that. You see, Fritz is actually classically taught on the pianos, and he might actually be as capable a pianist as Keith Emerson is, showcasing his abilities of course in the Triumvirat albums. And in 1972 the band recorded a demo tape for their Visioned album, which would actually include 2 side-long suites on it, and they pitched the album idea to EMI and they definitely really loved it, so they signed them up right away and set them up for recording sessions that same year. But just before recording commenced, the bassist and vocalist for the band, being Werner Fragenberg, actually opted to leave the band, and instead of him it was replaced by Hans Pepe, who does the bass and vocals on the debut. And the band's debut did come out in April of 1972 and it would be called Mediterranean Tales, and this one was actually reasonably successful to some extent, even granting the band a tour across Europe and even in the US where they opened for Fleetwood Mac. And in 1974 the band would come back into the studio to record their sophomore album, and this one would go on the same formula of basically having 2 side-long suites on either sides of the album, and this one would be called Illusions on a Double Dimple. And as they started working on the title track from the album, they had Pepe doing the vocals and the bass, but unfortunately suddenly in the middle of recordings Pepe decided that he wanted to leave the band to go ahead and get married, which left them without a bassist and a vocalist and they had to replace him. Luckily they did recruit one Helmut Kuhlen, who was a sound technician in the studio at the time and also happened to be a bassist and a vocalist, as well as also being Fritz's cousin, but honestly I didn't find any source stating that that was an intentional decision by them. And he joined the band in the middle of recording and he is the one performing the bass and most of the vocals on the second side of the album, being Mr. 10%. Now personally, since reviewing this album over on episode 10 of the series, I've grown to love it to astronomical lengths. Okay, I love Illusions on a Double Dimple so much, and I see so many people saying that, oh my god, the bass playing by Hans Pepe on the first side is just so bad, and I'm like, I don't know, I think that both him and Kuhlen are just really cool, I guess, and they do the job quite well. And as for Triumvirat always staying to be this powerful trio of people, well, they've definitely have managed to do so despite the changing members. And well, the album itself would of course release in 1974 to some great success, and that would lead the band to come back into the studio just 1 year afterwards in 1975 to record their 3rd studio album called Spartacus. Now, it doesn't take a genius to understand what the concept behind the album is. If you don't know the story of the mythical figure of Spartacus, he's basically a former gladiator that escaped from Rome, assembled an army of slaves, and then rebelled against Rome yet again with a rebellion which was known as the Third Slave Rebellion, which took place, I believe, between 73 and 71 BCE. And while the rebellion itself was pretty successful for most of its duration, it was crushed at the end, and thus the rebels lost. And well, much like the 2 albums that came before Spartacus, this one was also a hit, debuting in the 27th spot on the top billboards, which is definitely something to behold. But in my personal opinion, I still do think that Illusions on a Double Dimple is way better. Now, the album itself, at least technically and sonically speaking, does sound quite a bit like its former. You do have Jürgen Fritz on the keyboards being just so virtuosyncratic all over, playing the analog keyboards, playing the pianos, playing the mellotrons, Hammonds, whatnot, and he's so freaking good at everything that he does. And of course the other 2 members are just so ecstatic and so powerful in their own right that it truly makes up for this one-of-a-kind band. But when it comes down to the concept of this one, I feel like it lacks a bit, and seeing this album is actually made up of 9 individual tracks, so it doesn't go with the usual formula of 2 suites, but instead it has 9 individual songs on it, which do not flow into one another and definitely somewhat stall the sense of progression that this story is supposed to be telling. Now, of course, a concept album can be many things. It doesn't have to have songs that flow into one another seamlessly to tell a story, but in the case of this one, it feels to me like the band were trying and maybe get off with some radio-friendly hits, and they've definitely done so, seeing as this album is really popular. But the thing is, as it comes down to the entire story being told, despite technically stating the story and what's going on, I feel like the real action only starts around the second to last and the last songs on the album. Yes, the second to last song on the album is called The March to the Eternal City, and it's a really good track. It's a bit stale in one regard, but in another regard it just does feel like this very big war march, going into war with something very grandiose in the background of things. And of course then it flows up to the next track on the album, which is actually called Spartacus, which is special because it's the only one of the 9 tracks on the album that doesn't start off with a the something, and I think that's kind of cool and aesthetically pleasing to a sort of way. And Spartacus is in fact my favorite track from the album. It takes everything that this album and this band knows how to do right and puts them all together. And when I talk about that, you do have to sort of understand the 2 categories that songs in this album fall under. So you have the more rock ballads, which are definitely quite virtuosyncratic as well, but they're calmer, more piano played and more friendly. And then you have the EOP going all out stuff, a lot of analog keyboards and synthesizers, which is good, but I don't feel like any track really takes the 2 and merges them together as well as Spartacus. Though if there's one thing on this album that kinda confused me to a certain extent, was definitely its ending. The ending of the story, as I noted, was the rebellion being crushed, people getting crucified along the main road. You know, it's pretty bleak, it's pretty dark, but the thing is, this album just kind of states it off on a whim. You don't really get that you get to the ending of the story, and then it goes off into this big, very grandiose, royal ending, which sounds really happy, despite the ending not being that much so. And yes, you can say that there's some sort of an oxymoron going on there or something like that, but it doesn't feel that intentional, and I think that drives home the fact that this entire album, while it might have an interesting idea behind it, doesn't really execute it to perfection. But nevertheless, we are talking about Triumvirat, and this album will surely grow on me as time goes by, because honestly, how can it not? They're so freaking good. And to sum things up about Triumvirat, yes, I know that they are somewhat copying ELP, but they're not really doing the same things as these guys did, and they definitely aren't copying them one for one. And when it comes down to creativity and abilities, Triumvirat stand on their own, and I love them to bits worth, and I'm really anxious to getting to know their other albums. So this album cover continues the trend from the last one, having the mouse on it and, you know, having it something to do with Triumvirat, despite the fact that I would have expected seeing a rat, but apparently a mouse is just more photogenic. Now, I do get that on the last album called Illusions on a Double Dimple, it's pretty hard to get across what that might mean using the mouse, but in this one I feel like they could have made at least a bit more related cover to the entire topic of this album, because as it stands I have no idea what does the light bulb have to do anything with the story of Spartacus, but for what it's worth I think it's also iconic for its contrast. But honestly, to be truthful, I feel like this cover is just one of those cases of cover that looks so freaking cool and unique that you just kind of have to justify it no matter what the album behind it is. So yeah, I guess this is a cool cover and I will be content with it. So overall, this album is definitely strong, but it's also not as strong as its former, and for that it's gonna get a rating of 8 out of 10. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're gonna be doing the last episode of 365 Days of Prog, reviewing The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway by no other than Genesis. Of course, I want to let you all know that I wish you a happy New Year's and celebrate responsibly and do whatever, and you know what, I'll see you tomorrow in a very special finale episode for 365 Days of Prog. But for now, I'd like to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon. So thank you so much to Cleowan, Arist of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox for being here for so freaking long. You know, these guys have been supporting the channel for so long. They've been so loyal. I'm so grateful for them. You know, they've helped me just buy pens and notebooks for these reviews, and honestly, this has been more than I could have ever asked for. So thank you so much, guys. You have been so integral to the creation of this series. But yeah, that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.